Who would fardels bear, I ask you? I confess this line is among my favorites from a very great and very odd play, Hamlet. I'm attracted first by the rich sound of that strange word, fardel. It's furry, homespun, weighty, but also soft, a funny word, and an alien one. And its strangeness makes the question, which feels so very emphatic, feel strange, itself a bit funny. However, as time has gone by and I've had a chance to reflect at greater length upon the poem and the burden of truth and mystery which it bears, the import of this word and this question has grown clearer to me. The line is still one of my favorites, but now, in addition to presenting a young American reader with furry strangeness, it also, I submit, yields a clue to understanding this play, which, like the Hydra, seems to respond to critical inquiry by becoming ever more complex. Indeed, though the word is modest enough, I want to present the case that this word creates something of a bridge to another great play of Shakespeare's, The Winter's Tale, which is organized around many of the same themes as Hamlet. Taking the witness of these two plays together, I want to consider what Shakespeare teaches us about suffering, patience, knowledge, and peace, or the opposite of these. What can this strange line possibly have to do with such immense human experiences? To begin considering this, we need to parse the words and to set the context. Who would fardels bear? Hamlet asks. The question clearly centers on the verb, the action of bearing. Fundamentally, this question asks, who would bear something? That something, then, is this mysterious fardel. A fardel, at its most basic, is a bundle. Usually, it is a sort of container filled with things to be worn on the back, like a rucksack or a kit bag. But it isn't just the bag itself. A fardel is always filled. That is to say, it is always a burden. Hamlet, then, is asking, rhetorically, who would bear burdens? Who wants to live a life which involves the strain and stress of bearing a burden? Indeed, a life which is characterized by bearing burdens. We need to build up some context in order to see this line in its fuller light. Who is this Hamlet who speaks these words? And why is he so interested in asking whether one ought to bear burdens? And what does all of this have to do with knowledge? The Hamlet we meet at the beginning of the play is a man who is suffering greatly. Hamlet suffers from the apprehension and experience of evil, and this awareness shakes his fundamental assumptions about the goodness of the cosmos and its creator. He bears the great natural grief of losing his father to an untimely and unexpected death. Moreover, his uncle, rather than he himself, has ascended to the throne of Denmark. Furthermore, his mother has just married his uncle. This marriage disturbs Hamlet on two accounts. First, its haste. To remarry within 2 months of one's bereavement seems to discount the spiritual reality outwardly expressed by the prescribed period of mourning. His mother's haste to be re-wed causes him to wonder whether she ever cared for his father, and even to doubt the validity of love between a man and a woman. Second, he has married her husband's brother, a union within forbidden degrees of affinity. The impropriety of both the haste and the spouse, combined with the unexpected thwarting of his political ambition, drive Hamlet to suspect some sort of foul play and to doubt the solidity of the state and of the family, the two most central communities within which a human experiences his life. Questioning the goodness of these communities, Hamlet is left in a sort of existential vertigo. He begins to doubt the goodness of everything, In his first soliloquy, near the beginning of the play, Hamlet articulates this agonized distrust of cosmic and particular goodness. Oh, that this too sallied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon 'gainst self-slaughter. Oh God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on it, fie. 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. Life itself has become an intolerable burden, something which, had God not forbidden it, one ought to destroy as soon as possible. The weight of that burden comes from realizing that the world is subject to sin and corruption. While Hamlet begins within the safety of a subjective statement about how he perceives things, the world seems stale, flat, and unprofitable, his next sentence makes an unqualified judgment about its metaphysical status. It is an unweeded garden, gone to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. If the world had been a garden, a fertile place characterized by order, beauty, goodness, and grace, imagine the Garden of Eden. That order and beauty and grace have all passed away. Only fertility remains, but a fertility not of what is wholesome or fruitful, but rather of things rank and gross in nature. Adam and Eve have abandoned the garden, and all of its virtue has dissipated or corrupted as a result of their neglect. Sin, it would seem, has defaced all goodness, even goodness itself. God has become the stern captain who constrains within his corrupted order every would-be mutineer against it by keeping his canon, which is condemnation, eternal damnation, trained on the only way out. His canon fixed against self-slaughter. This speech reveals a trajectory of thought which is characteristic of Hamlet, and which I will suggest is characteristic of a school of thought, if I may call it such, which was of great and pressing contemporary interest to Shakespeare, that is, skepticism. I will return to the stages of this trajectory as Hamlet experiences presently. But first, I want to outline the important points of skepticism as the skeptics presented it. There is a difference between the way that Shakespeare presents skepticism and the way that they would present it themselves. Okay. Philosophical skepticism received its purest form, that is, Pyrrhonic skepticism, in late antiquity, in the early around the turn of the millennium, but on the BC side, and grew as a sort of school until the widespread of Christianity. That the school was current and important even up to the late 4th century AD is attested by the fact that one of the first works that St. Augustine wrote after deciding to become a Christian, he wrote it during his catechumenate, was called Against the Academics. It is a dialogue in which the interlocutors debate the possibility of arriving at any firm assent to truth. The Academy, that school founded by Plato, had become the center of Hellenistic skepticism, and so the name academics has become code for skeptic. Augustine felt the need, it seems, to mount a defense against the arguments of this school. And the delicacy, earnestness, and length of that dialogue suggests that Augustine himself felt the attractive power of those arguments rather keenly. Like all ancient philosophies, skepticism sought as its final cause to achieve happiness. But how is one to live happily? Presumably, one would seek the counsel of the philosophers, those who know, in order to learn such wisdom. But, funnily, what we hear from the Stoic disagrees with what that peripatetic argues, and both face refutations from that atomistic Epicurean, while the cynic sits in his barrel telling Alexander and Aristotle alike to get out of his sunshine. Is there a soul that persists after death? Or are there only atomic particles? Do the senses reliably witness to reality? Is it possible to demonstrate any position at all? The skeptic observes that philosophers themselves cannot seem to agree on a common basis of argumentation. There is no shared foundation upon which to build up a philosophy of eudaimonia. The skeptical response to this confusion among the philosophers is to begin to doubt that anyone knows what he is talking about. And happiness is too important a thing to fool around with or stake on some rash assent of this or that, apparently indemonstrable view of the way things are. Furthermore, the skeptic is well aware that the earnest student, the one who is really zealously seeking knowledge, will grapple with these and other huge questions and with the difficulty of finding a resolution to them. He knows that this student will feel anguish and vertigo when he finds this or that principle, which he had thought was basic and universal, shown to be, or to seem, shallow, unstable, insufficient, or even incorrect. The mental anguish, this mental anguish, is the greatest of pains, being spiritual in nature. It is the lack of the highest part of the human's being. In Aristotelian terms, this anguish arises because our innate desire to know is being thwarted, or at least detained. Any restraint from the natural fulfillment creates pain. But the skeptic does not see this pain as the thwarting of nature. Instead, he views it as the natural consequence of attempting to do something which can't be done, like trying to lift a 10-ton boulder or to force a square peg into a round hole. We have duped ourselves, he says, into thinking that we are capable of knowledge. And then we frantically strive to become knowers, all the while following the will-o'-the-wisp ever deeper into the bogs of despondency and false opinions. Let me return to the trajectory of thought, which I want to identify in Hamlet, and which I allege is Shakespeare's commentary upon the true motivation of skeptical suspension. Forgive me, there is one note that I've edited out, so I need to come back to it. What the skeptic proposes to do in the face of all of this confusion is to lead his student through a series of questions which cut at the roots of different things, like the validity of the senses, like the ability of the reason to know things, and to lead that student into such a feverish boil of uncertainty, that the only way to get out of it is simply to withhold assent. It's to step back and say, I won't affirm anything. I'm not even going to try to affirm this or that as true. That suspense of judgment is the aim of the skeptical practice. And the peace, which the skeptics propose will follow, they call a state of imperturbability, ataraxia. So that imperturbability is the goal, is the sort of disposition of heart that the skeptic aims at by sort of filling out or stirring up all of this mental anguish. Okay. So they want to get rid of the mental anguish. They see mental anguish as a problem. They want to neutralize it, destroy it. And the way they do that is by making it so intense that the only escape, suspending belief or suspending assent, would naturally follow. Okay, so let me return to the trajectory of thought, which I want to identify in Hamlet, and which I allege is Shakespeare's commentary upon the true motivation of this skeptical suspension of judgment. Through the strange events that initiate this play's action, Hamlet has become aware, in an existentially significant way, of sin and the corruption which it introduces into the world. Sin destabilizes knowledge because it betrays trust. It proves that something can be used or done for ends other than those natural to them. It creates the possibility that seeming, how something appears, can deceive, can attest to being, rather to a being, which doesn't in fact exist. If something betrays me, for example, my mother, the electoral system, church authorities, what is to stop anything from betraying me? How can I discern that anything is trustworthy? By suffering the pain of this awareness, as well as the pain of the disorder, thus introduced into the cosmos and into one's own life, a man will cease to trust that all things which God has made are fundamentally good. That affirmation so central to Christianity's affirmation of the goodness of the body, over and against which so much of the clearest Greek philosophy contends. Namely, and God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Any sin destroys the goodness of the whole, just as any crack in the window destroys the whole picture, just as any lie defeats one's own credibility. Thus, the apprehension of sin or of defects in nature, in this mode of thinking, ultimately lead to universal doubt. Shakespeare wants to display, I submit, that the apprehension of the existence, as it were, of evil, without the internal ability to suffer its presence stably, will lead the soul to a skeptical distrust. Put another way, without the habit of patience, the soul will have a disposition which renders it vulnerable, perhaps inescapably vulnerable, to doubt. Considering Hamlet, we last saw him reflecting upon the corruption of the garden that had been beautiful, but which is now filled, possessed even, exclusively by things gross in nature. Hamlet returns to this idea and sharpens it a few scenes later in Act 1, Scene 4, where he reflects that men, carrying the stamp of one defect, his virtues else, be they as pure as grace, as infinite as a man may undergo, shall, in the general censure, take corruption from a particular fault. The dram of ill doth all the noble substance of a doubt to his own scandal. I'll have to parse some of that Shakespearean language there. But this single fault, this minutest modicum of contamination, is enough to mute and corrupt the excellence of a life otherwise virtuous. It renders that character irremediably doubtful and destroys it. The language and idea remind us of the way the apostolic chorus treats of the old law. If we break one tenet, we break the whole law. But nowhere in this speech is there any suggestion of the New Testament's hope for redemption. All we have is, if you break the perfect thing, it remains broken forever, irremediably. There's no way to get your reputation back. There's no way to restore trust. Similarly, in lines which Hamlet speaks to Ophelia shortly after his to be or not to be soliloquy, he asks, "Why wouldst thou be a breeder of sinners? I am myself indifferent honest, but yet I could accuse me of such things, that it were better my mother had not borne me. What should such fellows as I do, crawling between heaven and earth? We are errant knaves, believe none of us." To be a human, on this reading, is to be a sinner. And to be a sinner is worse than to have never been born. Clearly, any restoration through forgiveness is not present in these meditations on sin. In such a sin-dominated world, to be a man is to be an errant knave, bereft of purpose. What should we do, crawling betwixt heaven and earth? And equally important, to be untrustworthy. What should such a man do indeed? With such a view of the universe, it is difficult to see how any action at all could be justified. It would simply contribute to the infinite multiplication of errant knavery. The hopelessness of these words, I suggest, arises from the vice of impatience, the inability to suffer real evil well. to absorb the shock and the pain of imperfection, corruption, and injustice, or to accept magnanimously the broken condition of things in order to enable them to be mended, indeed, in order to enable oneself to participate in their mending. Now we can return to the to be or not to be soliloquy with a clearer sense of how the bearing of burdens figures into the thematic development of the play. When Hamlet asks whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, he is asking whether patience, bearing up under these woes, these sallies of fortune, is even a good thing at all. He begins by asking whether patience or Cato-like suicide is the nobler action. But the body of the speech is devoted to all the reasons why one would want to leave the world betimes. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life? The word to which I've drawn our attention, fardel, becomes a symbol, even the metonymy of the suffering inherent in post-fall human experience. The question, who would fardels bear, has come to mean, why would anyone even consider bearing the burdens of life? Implicit in the question itself is a fundamentally impatient disposition. As Hamlet progresses through this line of reasoning, the question with which the soliloquy opened is shown to be an unreal one, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer or to take up arms. There is no nobility in suffering at all. All the nobility is on the side of making one's quietus with a bare bodkin. We endure because we are afraid of that canon fixed against self-slaughter, of damnation. Only those made cowardly by conscience, here meaning the dim foreboding that the afterlife exists, bear burdens. We all bear burdens, not because it is good to do so, or because the suffering thus entailed might be the prerequisite to the fulfillment of some meaningful act or the achievement of some better state in soul, family, or polity, but rather because we are afraid of the stronger whips and scorns of eternity. But to bear suffering out of love for the Lord and the good institutions which he has established in this world, our soul, our family, our polity, is infinitely different than to bear it through cringing, servile terror. It is the difference between patience and the suffering that either numbs or embitters the heart. It is perfectly possible to suffer impatiently. Indeed, impatience is what gives suffering its sting. I'm going to turn over to The Winter's Tale now. And I'll keep my comments here brief, though that play could sustain just as long a treatment, much longer indeed, on its own account. Allow me to posit that this play also dramatizes the impatient fixation upon evil, or as one of the characters calls it, the doctrine of ill-doing. Its main character, Leontes, the king of Sicilia, nourishes some of this Puritanism, this allergy to the presence of evil. And when he begins to imagine that his wife, Hermione, is unfaithful to him with his oldest friend, Polixenes, the king of Bohemia, he cannot bear this mental unrest that would attend the simultaneous actions of believing her to be chaste and wrestling with the counter-arguments. Unfortified by habitual patience, Leontes prefers to capitulate to the certitude that his wife is unfaithful. The buckling of Leontes' impatient character leads to all sorts of disasters. He loses his best friend and his closest counselor. Both of them flee to Bohemia. His wife and his son, who die in the midst of a tyrannous show trial, and his daughter, whom he banished, commanding that she be exposed and left to die. Brief little bit of the backstory. He condemns his wife when she's about 9 months pregnant. His friend, the king, has been on the island of Sicily for about 9 months. So he thinks that she's pregnant with his son of adultery. When all of these condemnations go out, the queen gives birth a little bit prematurely to this little baby daughter, which the king thinks is a bastard of his friend, the symbol of the distrust and iniquity, and the thing that he hates. So he commands that that daughter be exposed, just left out to die. Okay, so that's the backstory there. But, so I think that all comes about from the fact that Leontes is incapable of wrestling with the possibility of evil, right? Incapable of having the mental patience that would allow him to survive the tensions of that unrest. Okay. That's fine. That's where the play originates. That's where the action starts up, and Leontes is the central character. But I want to use this attention to Leontes as a foil for the significance of another character, an old Bohemian shepherd who discovers that little baby girl after she's been exposed. He enters the scene in the teeth of a gathering tempest. Literally, just the weather. It's about to storm, cats and dogs. Or bears, as it were, seeking a sheep which has been lost through the negligence of thoughtless hunters, grumbling. And these are his words. "I would there were no age between 10 and 23, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there is nothing in the between but getting of wenches with child, wronging the ancientry, stealing, fighting." This is his view of life. This is what the kids do between 10 and 23, right? Lots of evil, right? His view of youth is given a time of life which is given over to iniquity. He recognizes the reality. It's there. He sees it. He's clearly aware of the existence of evil. He suffers its consequences. He is out there, an older man, suffering from a tempest, trying to find a sheep that these kids, in their wild hunting, have driven away. So he's there, it's real, he's suffering it. I don't mean to say that he's a model of patience. He's griping about these things. But I do want to point out that his worldview is not shattered by the existence of evil and the threats that it poses to one's own experience of life. Seeing the baby girl, he intuits a likely account of her origin. So he's there, he's walking around, he finds the girl, he looks down, and he immediately intuits, I know just how this came. Sure, some scape. Though I am not bookish, yet I can read, waiting gentlewoman in the scape. This has been some stair work, some trunk work, some behind door work. They were warmer that got this than the poor thing is here. Right? He understands that this is a bastard child born out of wedlock. Right? He suspects that the child is herself a bastard, the creation of evil intent and foolish levity. And her presence in this deserted place is a demonstration of the kind of idiotic cruelty which he was just lamenting. Nevertheless, he knows what he ought to do. I'll take it up for pity, he says. He willingly bears the burden of responsibility for another person's life, even for the lives of those thoughtless people who were warmer that got it than she is now. Because he is able to see that this is a day to do good deeds on. If his patience is less noble, perhaps, than that demonstrated by Hermione in her trial, that scene is an amazing scene. I wish we had time to read it. It is still a strong, stabilizing, and life-giving patience. Now, with the girl has been left a box filled with gold and a note from the man who had been tasked with exposing her. And the shepherd protects this box. In fact, he protects it for the 16 years which intervene between Acts 3 and 4. Our treatment of patience, faith, and knowledge resumes when the engagement between the shepherdess, as she grows up into being, the engagement here between that shepherdess and the Prince of Bohemia, the son of Leontes' oldest friend, the one who he thought was committing adultery with his wife. When they meet and fell in love, all right, so that happens during the 16 years, and our treatment resumes when they get engaged at this big farm, this big harvest, sheep shearing festival. But their engagement is no sooner pronounced than it is rudely broken up by the prince's father. What kind of king wants his son to marry a sheepcote, right? You don't want that at all. So the king has come in disguise, hears the pronouncement of their engagement, unveils himself, and of course, what else would an angry father and king do in his tyrannical wrath besides threaten to disinherit his son and threaten to kill all of the shepherds? Not so good. All right. The prince, fortunately, the king, in his rage, isn't thinking very much about having his will accomplished. Maybe he just assumes everyone will do what he intends them to do. So he just leaves, and leaves the two lovers there to make a plan. Always convenient. So the two lovers are there. The girl thinks that the prince, Perdita is the girl's name, the Perdita thinks that this prince is going to abandon her, right? What else would he do? He keeps faith. However, he chooses to lay down his regality and to live the life according to the promise which he has made to her. He accepts the suffering that comes along with fidelity. Okay. Fortunately, they receive some counsel from Leontes' closest counselor, and they all set sail for Sicilia. Right? However, the counselor wants to restore the relationship between Leontes and the prince's father, Polixenes, so he tells Polixenes they're all going to Sicilia. So they all are going to converge on Sicilia. All right. So in all of this hurly-burly, that old shepherd who is scared out of his wits wants to prove that he is not related to the girl. He thinks, oh, if I show that I'm not actually her father, then the king won't sentence me to death. That's his argument. It's a funny argument, there's holes in it, but at any rate, that's what he wants to do. So in order to disprove his paternity, he runs to fetch that box with the gold and with the notes in it. He binds this box up into his rucksack and heads out in search of the king. But he's accosted by a nobleman who asks him questions about his gear. Says Autolycus, "The fardel there, what's in the fardel? Wherefore that box?" To which the shepherd replies, "Sir, there lies such secrets in this fardel and box which none must know but the king." The Winter's Tale is the only play, besides Hamlet, the only of Shakespeare's writings, besides Hamlet, to use the funny word fardel. These are the only two times. This scene, and then I'll show later on in one more scene. But these two plays are the only ones. Here, we find the fardel related to some of the major themes presented in the to be or not to be soliloquy, and also to its broader significance with regard to knowledge and patience. If, in Hamlet, the unwillingness to bear fardels suggested a fundamental impatience, which foreclosed the possibility of achieving true knowledge, and which ultimately contributed to a false interior satisfaction with false opinion, here, in the Winter's Tale, the shepherd does willingly bear the fardel. He's borne it for 16 years, and is bearing it now for the sake of revealing secrets. Within this fardel, or within the mystery of bearing burdens, of the virtue of patience, lies the possibility of achieving knowledge. Of course, the play draws near its end by bringing all of the characters who have been estranged back together in Sicilia. But it is only when the shepherd brings forth the fardel, it is referred to as such in the relevant scene, and its secrets are revealed, that the royal identity of the shepherd girl is made known, thus restoring the father to the daughter, turning the prince's beloved into a princess, thereby restoring the prince to his father. because of these identifying characteristics, the secrets inside of the fardel, the revelation thereof allows the restoration of communities thought forever destroyed. The shepherd's willingness to bear the burden of responsibility and even of mystery allows him to become a conveyor of a blessing absolutely beyond the reach of calculation and even of imagination. His patience becomes the condition of revelation and knowledge, not only for himself and his relatively narrow concerns, disproving that he's the Father, but for those whose concerns are great, wondrous, sublime even. This simple act of patience on his part preserves the welfare of two nations. Beyond all these, and through the grace of the god in the play, who is Apollo, the restoration of the lost princess creates the conditions in which an event singular in all of Shakespeare's plays can take place: the resurrection of the lost queen. When Hamlet wonders who would fardels bear, he presents his question rhetorically. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time? The oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. Hamlet believes the answer is no one, and he lives accordingly. In consequence, many men die who need not have, and his country loses its sovereignty. By contrast, all of the punishments just named in that segment of the speech are borne by the characters of The Winter's Tale, and especially all of them are borne by the queen. Those who hoped for the good are the ones who would bear fardels. Those who are willing to suffer, those who would fardels bear, receive what Hermione calls a better grace. Thank you.